He might have the record of has been on segregation longer than anybody, at least in this period. He's going on 20 years in segregation. If you can wrap your mind around that. He's my client, I can't wrap my mind around it. Being in one room, away from all other inmates, away from family for 20 years. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 20 years. So we're highlighting both reverse torture victims and we're highlighting those that are locked down in segregation because both of those are violations of human rights, as you see from our right. And I think, for lack of better terms, Keith Walker might be the poster child on that because he's been there so long. And he's my client, I know him quite well. So get the Keith Walker piece in one sheet of paper. Make sure you get signed in. When you sign in, I have to say this because we will actually use the sign-in sheets to stay in touch with you. We're not trying to organize. We're not trying to create an organization that, believe me, I don't need no more organization. But we do want to communicate with people. So what we've found, I know I won't have that in this audience, people when they write their email addresses, you can't read them. So make sure that they're readable so we can be in touch with you. And I asked the Milcar, make sure you remind people, don't do too fast. In a hurry to sit down and get a seat. Because we do want to have you on the email in a folder, keeping up with what's going on with the short-term strategy that I will unfold later. Seems like there's one other, so there's the petition to the governor, there's the agenda, there's the piece on Keith Walker. It seems like there's one other thing that I can't think of. Somebody remind me, is there one other thing?
I wasn't listening, I'm sorry. No, what did you?
No, there's the agenda, there's the Keith Walker piece, and there's the sign-in, there's a sign-in, the petition, there's sign-in into the meeting. I think that's it. I was in the process of doing a separate petition on Keith Walker, but I ran out of time, so I'll do that, and we'll probably do that by, on the internet. And it'll basically be directed at the head of the Illinois Department of Corrections and the ward at Pontiac where he is a prisoner and where he's in segregation. Basically demanding that he be taken out of segregation immediately based on human rights grounds. And we'll talk about more because the framework of this meeting is human rights. And we'll talk about the fairly recent critique, or stronger than a critique, the special rapporteur, which is an expert of the United Nations under the Commission Against Torture, has some very, very strong words to the United States about keeping people in segregation for lengthy periods of time. He said 14 days is like a max. We got keeping in there for 14 years. So he says, stop it. Now, of course, the United States, for the most part, ignores stuff that they don't want to do, right? So that's going to be part of our discussion because the only people that can make them stop ignoring human rights violations are people in this country. Nobody else can do that. If we build a strong enough movement, we'll force their hand and stop it. And we got a good example here in Chicago where John Burge is probably getting out of prison soon, but he would not be there, in my view, in the views of many others, if we had not taken this case into the international arena. We have been doing work, and I'm getting into my discussion later. Sorry, not too bad. I'll sit down and shut up. We have been trying to get Burge detectives indicted for over 2 decades. 2 decades, working tirelessly, doing everything that you can do in a democracy. Petitions, lawsuits, post-convictions, meet with the city council, hearings with the city council, Cook County Board hearings, appealing to the U.S. attorney, appealing to the state's attorney, taking trips to the Justice Department. You name it, we did it. And then we decided to take it to the international level, as many of our ancestors had told us to do years ago, including Malcolm and others. And within 7 months, John Burge was indicted. It's not a coincidence. The United States made a calculated decision that it's not worth it to ignore it. So we take stuff United States, just ignore it. But they made a calculated decision, it wasn't worth it to get all that publicity that we got from this one Creek cop. So they said, get it. And they got it. They didn't get them enough because it was statute of limitation around there with torture and stuff. You know, so they could have gotten them earlier, but they ignored it. In my view, they could have charged them with attempted murder. You know, I see them get creative with my clients all the time. You charge them with stuff I haven't even thought about. If you torture somebody and force them to confess to a crime that they didn't commit, and then if they end up on death row, what do you call it? I call it attempted murder. If Governor Ryan had not released them, they'd be gone. And these detectives would be off parties. So to let them get away, that's a crime in and of itself, in my view. And a lot of crooks were involved in it. Judges, state attorneys, U.S. attorneys, all of them contributed to that crime against our community. So I think I got started already. Yeah. No, I don't think that. I need you you're down here as part of welcoming our people. So let's get started, because we have a tight, fairly tight schedule. So you want to come up? The Harrisons, why don't you all come up here? But you're on the program. Kim Harris and Kelly, JR, did he get here yet? Okay. Sorry. So we're going to get started. I'm Stan Willis. Many of y'all know me, I think. Let me first welcome everybody. I'm glad you came out. It's a pleasure having you here. I want to acknowledge, first of all, the mothers, and I want you all to stand up if you feel like it. I can tell the mothers what to do. Right? If the mothers want to stand up, the mothers of torture victims, I want to honor you first and acknowledge you. It's hard to even imagine. And I think, why is the group going to say something to the audience? I don't know. Did you tell me that?
I believe it's going to be Frank Chapman.
Okay, Frank, okay, that's cool. Frank will be here shortly. Also want to acknowledge the sponsors of this event. Let me find the sponsors on my sponsor list. I can tell you who some of them are even before I look into this. Of course, the National Conference of Black Lawyers, my home organization, is introducing this. Sponsors are National Conference of Black Lawyers, Black People Against Police Torture, organization that I helped pull together. Larry Kennedy is here, one of our co-chairs of National Black People Against Police. So you want to stand up, you just want to raise your hand. The Chicago Council on Black Studies. I know you are a part of it. That's Chicago State University African American Studies Department. This is all the department. The Chicago Independent Human Rights Council, that's had here, Hill Chair, she's not here tonight. She had a prior commitment. The Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, anybody here from the coalition? I used to be in the coalition, very close to the coalition. I was in local 241. Y'all know nothing about that, so I don't even get into it. And then the Human Rights Network. Also wanted to acknowledge the Nation of Islam as a representative. My regard to Mr. Farrakhan and my brother.
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you for coming. Really appreciate you having me. Who else do we want to acknowledge? These folks here look familiar. How you doing?
I'm right.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
Always.
Now, let me impart an introduction, and then I'm going to introduce Kelly Kim, Sally Vicky Casanova Willis, my wife. Meet my wife. They're going to kind of give a framework of this developing human rights movement, at least to the extent in Chicago. We made quite a bit of progress. I'll talk to you a little bit about the progress we made in the reverse torture cases, because I convinced my colleagues to kind of change the strategy and have an international strategy, and it worked. So I'll talk to you about that a little later. But they're going to talk about some of the things. Kelly's going to talk about, I think, things that happened at Chicago State University. Salim, I believe, is going to talk about the wonderful meeting we had at Trinity United Church of Christ. We brought in the the director of the Human Rights Network about a month and a half ago. And the movement is growing, and we're going to talk about the importance of its growth. So before I get to them, let me just kind of lay the framework. The developing human rights movement, the movement that we need to develop, is what we call a people-centered movement, meaning that we're going to be using the human rights frameworks. This year is a very special year because the human rights framework has a lot to do with treaties that the United States has signed under various human rights conventions. The United States has signed some, but not all of them. They've signed the treaty related to torture, the Convention Against Torture. And that's really what this is about to a great extent. They've signed the treaty to eliminate racial discrimination, CERD. They've signed the treaty on civil and political rights. And the treaty against genocide. They have not signed the treaty, and don't ask me why, because I'm not in the White House or in the Congress, on the protection of children, of the child. You know, and that's kind of mysterious why they wouldn't. They're one of the few that haven't signed. Most of the world's community has signed, but the United States, the so-called citadel of democracy, has not signed. They have not signed the treaty to protect women. Who knows? So there are some critical ones. They certainly haven't signed the one on economic and social rights. And I kind of get that because they don't want that. But the ones that they've signed, all of them that they've signed are their reporting requirements this year. And that's significant for people that are involved in trying to build a movement, because when the United States has to report, they literally have to do, at a certain date, they have to send a written report on, for example, the Committee to Eliminate Race Discrimination. They have to send a report on the advances that are being made in race relations and how they are resolving racism in America and all these various sectors, including criminal justice, housing, education, etc. And so they have a report. Once it becomes due, those of us that are trying to build a movement, some are NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and some just community activists, we get a copy of the report. And it's been facilitated because of this group called the U.S. Human Rights Network that have basically pulled us together. And they celebrated their 10th year anniversary last December. And they're critical, strategically critical, that they're there and they able to gather and keep us in touch with other people around the country. And so we prepare in a rebuttal to the United States report. So if they have a section on criminal justice, we read it and tear it apart. And that's, that's part of what happens. And then, after we do that, the United States can respond. It's all in writing. And then what follows that, the United States has to go to Geneva, Switzerland, to the United Nations, and answer questions by the Committee Against Torture, for example, or the Committee to Enforce the Convention Against Race Discrimination. And that's a body of people from all over the country, all over the world, from different countries. And they're only effective if we prepare them to be effective. So they don't know what's happening in the United States. They're from, South America, Africa, etc. So we prepare that committee to cross-examine the United States. So when they come with their report, they're able to ask them very pointed questions about, criminal justice and the fact that so many black folks are locked up in mass incarceration, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of how the treaty reporting works. But before we start with the discussions on various aspects of human rights as it's developed in the United States, the United States of Chicago in particular, let me take a moment to also acknowledge and give my young brother a chance to welcome everybody, because this is his place, and I'm talking about Brother Dr. Conrad World, if he will come up and welcome everybody. I didn't forget you, Conrad.
The first problem is your language, right?
First problem.
You know I'm a year older than you. So that young thing, you need to throw it out the window. Because you was in 60 and I was 59. You went to Crane, I went to Hyde Park, and we really didn't like you all. Be quiet, Cooper, you went to do Thumb, and we didn't like y'all either. So, welcome to the Carruthers Center for Inner City. Coy, and you was in another place. I don't even know if you were. Brother, didn't I see you when you came out the joint?
Yes, sir.
Well, speak up, man. I haven't seen you in a long time. So welcome to the Carruthers Center for Inner City Studies, Northeastern Illinois University. This is 48 years on point, 38 for me. I see Professor Starks over here. He's Professor Emeritus. He's been here a long time. So we've been having meetings like this in this building even before the Carruthers Center came into existence. This building was built in 1905 when the Polish people lived around here. Then when we took it over, we still came to the building. So in 1966, the center emerged in 48 years. But what I was thinking about, Stan, and you all do know that we offer degrees here. We have a bachelor's degree in inner city studies education. We have a master's degree in inner city studies education. 148 of our master's graduates have gone on to earn PhDs in colleges and universities throughout the United States. But Stan, what I was thinking about is like Robeson, Patterson, and Du Bois. That's 1951. That's when we leaked in, and that is when 1948, the Genocide Convention Treaty was passed. Am I correct? This is off the top of my head. And then the spirit of our international work, and at that time, their petition was around police brutality in the United States. And they took their petition to Paris and then brought it back to New York. But then Malcolm, of course, said we needed to take our case to the United Nations and our struggle needed to be redefined to a human rights struggle. Is that correct? I'm just giving a little background.
That's correct,
Do I have a historical understanding?
Yes, sir.
And then, of course, here comes the little National Black United Front trying to pick up off of Robeson, Patterson, and Du Bois in 1996 on the crack cocaine phenomenon in America. And so we gathered petitions and we went to Geneva, Switzerland, and we charged the United States government with genocide. And so Stan just made a point about the impact of organizing at the international level and how that impacted when they finally decided to indict Byrd. But when we came back from Geneva, Switzerland in 1997 with our little delegation, we got a receipt from the State Department that they had received our complaint against the United States government. And Clinton gave a speech out in San Diego calling for a race commission and appointed John O. Franklin as chair. And a lot of people don't make the connections. And at that time, we were mounting up around the demand for reparations of African people worldwide. And then on the way to that, we took it up a notch, and many of us began to participate on the ground for the organizing of the UN World Conference Against Racism, of which Attorney Willis and others participated in, and our strategy was to push hard for the UN World Conference Against Racism that was held in Durban in the summer of 2001 to declare that the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, and colonialism were crimes against humanity. And I forgot you was on that trip. Kugler, you bought me a very nice bag over there in Durban. Thank you very much. And so, quit laughing, Kugler. So, and now here comes Mr. Willis, the National Conference of Black Lawyers, and the important work around torture. And all this is connected to the international organizing work that's mounting and mounting for people of African descent worldwide. So I won't talk too much more, but I'm glad I'm still here. We're still on top. We're still organizing. Mr. Willis and I have been crossing paths. And I see Attorney Larry Kennedy, unsung hero in the movement in this city, and his legal work, his pro bono work. And in that regard, we got another meeting here Saturday, because we need to get some money so we can quit going to these other people and finance our lawyers to handle our cases, because one of our big problems in the injustice system is we don't have the resources to give the people. And so people like Stan, people like Larry, over the years have done so much pro bono work, I don't even know how they have survived all these years in business as lawyers. So on Saturday, Maggie Anderson and her family spent a whole year trying to buy black, and they did successfully buy black. She wrote a book about it, and John Webster is chair of the National Black United Front in Kansas City. We're going to discuss upstairs in the auditorium black economics and self-determination. Can I get a witness? Yeah.
Okay, so let's go on to discussions of various components of the Chicago. I'm going to introduce to you Kelly Harris, who's a professor at Chicago State University. He's going to talk about summer work that's going on, the summer background is right, and I know Kim's going to talk about summer work that's going on. So, Kelly, why don't you start?
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
Conrad stole my thunder. He really did, because he touched on some of the things I want to talk about. Because I'm coming from a perspective of black studies, and I'll be brief. But it's interesting for me, as you know, as a student. I'm from Philadelphia, and I majored in African American Studies at Temple University. And as a student, I remember taking classes in African American Studies, but really at that time, it really wasn't any focus on international issues. Of course, it was focused on Afrocentricity, because it was a Temple, I'm going to let something. So we weren't really dealing with international issues, but I remember reading Clyde's book, Ryan Clyde, on international human rights, internationalism and human rights and black Americans in the United States. I remember reading that and sparking my interest in this human rights piece. Now I say Conrad stole my issue because when we look at black studies, which was founded and formed in 1968, we can't look at black studies as just a domestic movement. Black studies came into being because of third world mobilization, third world students and other students organizing with black students in San Francisco in 1967 and 1968. But even if we go beyond that, and I know it's become almost a cliche to say we stand on the shoulders of they who came before us and Sankofa go back and fetch it, but it is true. When we go back and look at it, and this is where Conrad stole my thunder, when we go back to 1947, the National Negro Congress, they wrote a petition about human rights violations in the United States. 1948, Du Bois and Patterson and others, which Conrad was talking about, with the human rights violation. In 1955, Congressman Charles Diggs wrote to Ralph Bunche. You all know Ralph Bunche. Congressman Diggs wrote to Ralph Bunche and said, you know, how can we organize our efforts around this human rights issue? And it's not a civil rights struggle, this is a human rights struggle. This is 1955. And Robeson and other folk had already been doing that in the 40s and the 50s. So, and as we all know, Malcolm, and not only did Malcolm say human rights, but you know, there's a meeting that Malcolm had at Sidney Poitier's house with Clarence Jones, who was Dr. King's lawyer. Is that right?
That's right.
He had in that meeting, you know, that we know about that meeting because of the FBI. They do good work. We know that meeting because of the FBI. And the FBI said the best idea that came out of it, and the most dangerous idea that Malcolm X had, which was to take the United States in front of the United Nations on human rights violations. And Clarence Jones said that was an idea that Dr. King loved to deal with. So it's interesting to me that in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, that when we look at the struggle, it was really international in scope and moving in the direction of human rights. Is that right?
That's right.
But now, as we look, and this is what comes to Chicago State and Black Studies in general, where we're at now, we have to go back to that because we've become somewhat parochial in our outlook. So now we have to go back to that. So one of the things that we do, you know, at Chicago State with our students is, and what we do with Chicago Council of Black Studies, is that we try to internationalize the scope. And we see the problems and the issues in our community with human rights violations. So when we see, and I know Kim will talk about these things, so when we see the school closing, we see those things as human rights violations. When we see the miseducation of African American and other folks, we see that as a human rights violation. When we see high unemployment rates, we see that as human rights violations. When we see food deserts, anything that we see that does not give people the ability to lead a good quality of life, we see as human rights violations. And I'm so happy now, and I should go back and thank Stan and Vicky for organizing this. I'm so happy that we're doing this because really people have always talked about the next stage of the struggle. But this has always been the stage that we should have been at, that we were at. And it was undermined by the United States intelligence forces. And this is the stage that we have to go back to and push for prisoners' rights and deal with these human rights violations. So I'll stop there and pass it on.
Okay, I teach African American Studies at Chicago State University, but prior to African American Studies, I taught English. So I'm always very concerned with definition, right? With words and the power of words and definition.
What's your name again, sister?
My name is Kim Delaney Harris. Yes. I teach African American Studies at Chicago State too. And so I'm always, in my classes, I try to help my students make connections, right? And look deeper than these superficial explanations and definitions, right? So we look at torture. What is that? What is torture? Immediately, in my mind, when you think of torture, I think of the movie, somebody being like burned or light shined in their eyes or waterboard, you know, all these kind of things. But torture comes in many forms. So on one hand, I'm very glad today. I was happy to participate in this because we want to talk about torture, right, and the victims of torture in the criminal justice system. But that's to open up the conversation. And then for me, I would like to take it a step further and help people understand what that is. What is torture? It's torture when you're in a school and you have to learn about and take to heart everybody else's culture but your own, right? That's torture. Yeah. It felt like torture to me when I'm sitting in school and I got to study white people's wars and all this stuff, and I can't learn nothing about myself. Nobody that looks like me. I was doing some research on writing on young men and their connection to education. I'm heavily involved in research and education. I just came back from a conference for this organization called ABEN, a Black Education Network. We had a retreat in California, right? All these educators, and we want to talk about education for Black people. Next week I'll be at a conference in Austria, Salzburg, in Austria, right? and I'm gonna talk about, and we're gonna talk about education and solve the global problems about education. Heal yourself, and then outside of self. That's just a basic survival thing, right? For anybody. And so for me, I want us to think about torture. To me, this is the end of the line torture, where we see torture manifested. And it's almost like violence. We could say violence if you stab me or shoot me, that's violence. But it's also violent if I can't get to no food. Because you're still trying to kill me. If you don't let me get the food, aren't you trying to kill me? If you deny me in America where everything has to be purchased, if you deny me what I'm going to need to get a job to purchase those things, that's violence, isn't it? You give me no education. And Kelly talks about all the time about abstract violence. So all the violence isn't just you come punch me in my face. Some of the violence is other keeping me from what I need to stay alive. Is that right? You are following me? Yeah. Torture is the same. I want you to broaden your understanding of torture in that same way. And in order to do it, you first have to, I invite everybody to read some stuff about Black studies, about liking yourself. Because you have to first like yourself to believe you're entitled to be treated like a human being. Right? Is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
Otherwise, people treat you any kind of way and you're just happy. Well, I'm happy they let me go. I'm happy, I'm just happy that, whatever. I'm happy you gave me a piece of bread and there's a whole feast over there, everybody else eating. That's not good. You have to understand that that's what sometimes in discussions about reparations, I'm saying be careful, like to say how we prove that we're entitled to. Your basic existence entitles you to some things. And so I want us to think about that in that way. We've been programmed, I talk to my students, I say, students don't even want to get link cards or whatever, right? New Orleans, when the flood happened, right? They said a lot of people who were entitled to public aid weren't on it because we've been shamed into thinking that's a bad thing. It cracks me up. It really cracks me up that your ancestors could put into their savings account for you for centuries, right? For centuries. And then they train you in your mind to think that you should be ashamed to get when you need it and you're trying to work your way through school. But yet you paid into it. It's a terrible thing. It's a terrible understanding. So I want us to go back to the basics and try to, that's what I try to teach in my class. Dig out, let's look at, of course we don't want you to get on public aid and think that's a great place and stay there. But if you need it right now while you work your way through school, I think it's okay. You know, if your kids need it, I think it's okay. So we want to look at torture, right? We want to look at human rights, and we want to make it palatable for everyday people so that the masses can engage in it. So I know Vicki, sometimes they had a speaker come out who was talking about, evictions. That's real for people, right? That's something people can hold on to. A lot of people have had people, their family members put in jail and treated unjustly. Those kind of things are real too, but sometimes people process like, well, maybe they did something wrong. People somehow mentally help find a way to disconnect from it, But it's real, and I think if we start with that, this is the most heinous, blatant ways, then we can help people understand how it's tied to other things that lead to somebody thinking they could just torture you and leave you in isolation for 20 years. Right? Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Asante. I'm thinking about the number of other things that are happening in the city throughout the day today. We have even many more people who would be here right now, but there's a simultaneous action going on following the one that happened at noon, because it is an internationally observed day in support of victims of torture. And we also call them torture survivors, because they're surviving, but they have been victimized. Our community has been victimized. These mothers, I get goosebumps every time I am with you all or with your primarily sons, because it was mostly black and brown men. And I was struck with the fact that the men were actually teenagers, most of them. when they were subjected to this really horrible, brutal torture. Brutal, that Stan is going to talk a little bit about more now. So it's kind of to what Kim was talking about, the power of words, right? The power of the word, the power of how you frame, how we talk about things and people and problems. And others have been shaping that conversation in those phrases. Hey, Tim. We got some powerful, powerful workers right here in this room right now. So I actually, in addition to us acknowledging the sponsors, I just really want to thank all of you all for making the time to be here. So my name is Sally, if you want to call me by my African name. My name is Vicky. That was another name that my mother gave me when I was born. I'm very proud to have it and to walk in it because my maternal grandmother was Vicky Victoria. I'm a student and a teacher, so folks have said a little bit about who they are. In addition to being the wife of who I call the baddest brother on the planet, but I also am the wife of somebody that belongs to you, right? When I met him, he belonged to you, he belonged to the community, and I'm very, very comfortable with that, very proud of it, very humbled, and so I had to figure out, okay, how do I step up and be a part of this community in a way that's respectful of all the work that many of you all have done together for decades. And so part of that work is just with the hat that I wear as an MBA and a teacher, a Master of Arts in Teaching the Cultural Arts. I came here to Chicago to work in business and also happen to be a mother of two young brown men, young black men. They're at a very young age, I became really clear because I grew up in the South myself that, you have two choices, and those are to fight and to fight. So my mother raised me to understand that we each have a role to play and that you bloom where you're planted. So Stan mentioned that I would talk a little bit about Trinity, United Church of Christ, and the teaching that we had there. That's just a little part of what I wanted to mention because it really, for me, within this human rights struggle, I came into this specific work around the Burge torture issues because Stan was organizing Black people against police torture right here in this space, and Black and white people against police torture. I gestured to some of the other founding members who are here who have just been consistent and fierce and working. So what I learned here, in addition to the fact that Chicago holds the notoriety of literally still not having done right by these folks that you'll hear about a little bit more in a moment, but that there are a number of very committed, very caring, very capable Black folks who can pull together across, interdisciplinary, intergenerational, interfaith, and just do what needs to be done. We shared ideas, we, followed, in some cases, the template that had been laid out for here's the thing, here are the steps that you go through to be able to resist and then totally thought out of the box. And I just wanted to encourage us to think about today as a recentering of that same spirit. And again, as Stan said at the beginning, not to sign up anybody to start another organization or anything. The sign-in sheets, we just want to stay in touch with you if you want us to stay in touch with you. He has some very amazing ideas. And then we have all of these other ideas and this energy in the room. And then we have a number of brothers that are still behind bars for crimes that they did not commit. And some of the work that Black People Against Police Torture initiated, these ideas right in this room, we were able to take to a certain level, and that got my total respect for the human rights framework and what additional things could be done to amplify the work that we're already doing, whether it's in education, whether it's in women's rights, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in, culture, and or whether it's around, I'm gesturing to one of the very newest lawyers in the room who's actually with First Defense Legal Aid. So interrupting the other end of that spectrum where when people first are arrested or profiled or whatever, to know that they have somebody that they can call for free that will come to represent them just in those critical first 48 hours so they're not making a confession. So I don't want to get us off track, but at all, and my husband, I'm glad that he let me speak today because I'm long-winded and I won't be. But I just care so deeply, and for me to have personally been able to be a part of something that, again, there were bus drivers in this room, there were legislators, there were in art, I should say, because this group still is working. And we need additional awareness and energy of this human rights, the international human rights framework, the actual application. So we had a teach-in, is one of several that need to happen. And what we did was just literally bring people together, as I have the privilege of being this African Diaspora Solidarity Chair at the Trinity Justice Watch team. Is not a ministry, it's just an informal group of people that have been engaged at some level in justice work. And if you're looking internationally, and we are an international people, right, we're African descendants, then you have to find ways to begin to learn what is available to you, and then figure out how you want to apply that. So I'm going to mention a couple of things, and then I'm going to pass this on. I know we'll come back for questions and answers, and talk about whatever is an immediate next step that Stan has suggested that we can move forward to. But I just want to say, for example, there were people that knew that they wanted to be involved, but they didn't know how to do, what to do next. So at a real simple level, some of you were able to get this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is international law, basically. These are things that you are entitled to. Has nothing to do with civil rights. You need to read it. I mean, I'm asking, I'm begging, because you will see some things in here that I haven't ever even thought about, that may be a way that we can frame our issues and our struggles, and then we need to participate in the process. We really are not participating in this process nearly enough. And it is just very critical, very, very, very critical that our voices are heard. So for example, the executive director, and you can tap the chair if I talk too long. So, the executive director of the U.S. Human Rights Network is a young sister who's actually Nigerian. And I think she grew up here, however, but she was born in Nigeria, HMD. And she is happy to come and talk with folks that need be, or whatever, about how to access the process. It doesn't have to be through a specific it can be your own organization. The stakeholder reporting process, for example, there's one that we're in the process of submitting just in the next 4 days, and that has to do with the CERD, if any of you may have heard, is basically the convention to eliminate all forms of racial discrimination. So even though it's not the CAT, the Convention Against Torture, this was racially motivated, all of it. Everyone that Burge and his henchmen tortured were black and brown boys. So it's primarily African American. So just as an example, there are stakeholders report. It may be 3 pages. It doesn't have to be an extremely lengthy thing, but we need to be able to submit those issues and complaints that elevate things like the school closing, like the refusal for Chicago to include African-centered education for our children, like the economic things that clearly are not an accident. So learning about that, we're not going to learn all about it tonight, but the website is on the back of here. It's just a really good resource. And I would urge everybody to take a look at the U.S. Human Rights Network as a facilitating kind of group, basically. It is a network, and the organizations decide at what level they want to participate. But to see what we were able to do with that knowledge and the unity and working together to amplify our voices, that brought a measure of justice at least, and some momentum. And the Chicago Burge torture cases tells me that we can do it with regard to homelessness, we can do it with regard to the evictions, we can do it with regard to education, you name it. So thank you for indulging me and just sharing how humbled I am And please join us in this work. I'll follow you, I'll support in any way that I can. We just have a lot to do. Thank you.
Are you all convinced that the human rights monument needs to be built? Did they just convince you? Let me go right to the point on a particular issue, because one of the questions is a legitimate question, is it feels kind of undefined. You know, we know human rights, but really what is it? And I'm still defining it. Let me talk about Burge directly. I was involved in the very first Burge case. I was working at Department of People's Law Office in 1988. I'm sorry, 1988. We got this request from Andrew Wilson. I get them mixed up. There's Andrew and Jackie Wilson. These are two young men who had killed 2 police officers on the south side of Chicago in 1983.